It was our share of the good earth. So the one person who became more attentive to procedures began to realize that the more the individual achieved freedom, the greater his difficulties became. The moment he believed himself to be capable of going above the common rules of his kind, he was in trouble. So the more sensitive individual began to recognize that rules were the basis of security, that the individual who kept the rules was the one who survived. The one who went out on his own did not survive. Seton used to tell this story about the bison herds in American Southwest. There were always some kinds of creatures, wolves, jackals, cats of various denominations and sizes, that wandered along side by side with the buffalo herd or the bison herd. And they were watching for one thing, and that was a young rebel. They were watching for a bison who decided to go out on his own, who would leave the strength of the tribe or herd and go forth conquering and to conquer. As soon as this individual animal with a higher ego got a few yards away from the herd, down came the carnivores, and in a very short time he was finished. Now the same thing happened on other levels. Seton pointed them out on an animal and human level. There are those who want to go out and do as they please regardless, who just won't take instruction or advice from anybody. They've got to do it themselves. So they wandered away from the herd and very soon get into serious difficulties, because strength was keeping the rules, weakness was breaking the rules. And no man, no matter how much he considered his own strength, was strong enough to break the rules. So out of this realization gradually emerged the concept of somebody who made the rules, and theology came into existence. But as yet it was all very primitive and tribal, and each tribe had a pattern of its own. But gradually it became evident and obvious that all of these tribes found the same experiences. They were in different localities, their philosophies worked out differently, but all by watching and observing came to the final conclusion that the universal laws were immutable, that they could not be broken. Man cannot break the laws, but the laws can break man if he disobeys them. So out of this gradually came the development of herds of animals as domesticated creatures, the building of towns and villages, and all kinds of experiments in individuality, in which the individual tried in all kinds of ways to find out what he could do. And as he went along, he found that when he did certain things, he had certain rewards, but everything he found it also had certain penalties. The moment he went away from nature and nature's basic principles, he was in a confusion. All of his own ideas were useful and helpful, and he was proud of them, but a great many of them led to trouble. As, for example, the more the village grew in size, the less possible it was to stay in it. The village had to be left behind because the problems of sanitation had never been solved, and therefore the village became a death trap, although it was the beginning of what we call civilization. And we're not quite certain now whether civilization is not an infirmity in itself. But regardless of all these things, our creature goes along. There was no schooling, as we know it, any more than there was school for rabbits and cats and dogs. But they all had their rules and they all had their laws, and they enjoyed what we might term today a natural ignorance. Now, a natural ignorance is not dangerous, really, because it is something we can get over. A natural ignorance afflicts everything that comes into this world. The babe that is born is not self-sufficient. Nothing that happens in our world is with a complete sense of certainty. There are always possibilities of alternate views, and most of all, there is the primordial lack of ultimate wisdom, which has afflicted man since the beginning of time. There are things we can know and the things we cannot know. And up to a certain point, everything we could know became natural, normal, and possible. And what we could not know became the source of eternal fears, doubts, wonders, and conflicts. There was no centralized opinion about things we could not personally sense with the limited faculties that we possessed. So we came out with an ignorant person. An ignorant person is one who is not schooled, but he's also one who may suffer now from ignorance, from the unwillingness to learn, or the unwillingness to accept ideas or beliefs that are contrary to his own willfulness. He will not accept the limitation upon his freedom without great resistance, and yet the freedom that he has perverted constantly since he first had it. His freedom can destroy him just as quickly as his bondage can. All the various patterns of life that he sets up are subject to certain rules and regulations which he has to finally accept. Somewhere in the dawn of time, the young sat around the old gentleman or the old squaw and listened to the stories of the people. They learned the ways of the jungle, of the forest, of the desert. They found out how to tell what foods were edible and what were poisonous. They found also how to create animal protection, to domesticate animals. They learned, unfortunately, also how to kill each other. But they were all parts of this early knowledge or early education. And this education divided sharply into two branches: the kind of education that helped us to do better and the kind of education that helped us to do worse. One was the means of advancing the divine plan, and the other was a means of opposing that plan by our own willfulness and determination to do as we please regardless of consequences. Out of this comes another little Bible story of the building of the Tower of Babel. Here people tried to build a tower that would go up to heaven, but they built it of mud and without straw. And as a result of it, it collapsed. And also, there was a division of tongues, and men no longer understood each other. So the building of a civilization was a long and difficult, arduous, and stress-laden procedure. But it was made worse not because of the actual seriousness of the situation, but rather of the unwillingness of living things to accept the basic truths of life. They would not accept equality. They accepted only that certain ones of them, would be better than others. They did not accept the general brotherhood. Some were brothers and some were enemies. And enemies were people who opposed the plans of those who did not like them. And in every case, all of these different decisions added up to a tremendous encyclopedia of basic facts. We gradually built up over the period of the first 50,000 years, probably, of man's inhabitants of this planet, a way of life, a code, a concept of existence. We finally came to certain basic conclusions about what could be and what could not be. And at a very early date, these conclusions were built into the subject of religion and theology. And it was assumed that the gods, the manados, or the great spirits, were responsible for these rules that men could not break, and that these various deities liked those who kept the rules and were a little unhappy about those who didn't keep the rules. And out of all this, the rules took on the idea of a moral tradition. They took on the pattern of the ancient wisdom, the wisdom that had been handed down from the past, the simple laws of common sense. So we may say that in the days of primordial ignorance, common sense gradually evolved as the panacea. There was nothing very scientific or very profound or very world-shaking about common sense, but it was a key to survival. It was a way of estimating the probabilities of things. It was a way also of approaching a problem from a point of experience, and that man could solve problems, and having solved them could leave a written record of these solutions for the service of those who came after him. So we have experience, and we have common sense, and we have folk knowledge as the basis of education. And then we know that the moment this occurred, humanity divided into two essential groups. Those who accepted this new concept of survival, who were glad and happy over being able to solve certain problems, and the other group who resented the whole idea from the very beginning because it interfered with doing exactly what they pleased. The freedom of will was hazarded, and this hazarding of freedom became a moral evil to those who were morally inadequate. So that we now have here the beginning of, we might call, an assumed ignorance, a new kind of ignorance, an ignorance resulting from the dissemination of false knowledge. And this false knowledge came into existence for one reason and one reason only: individuals not willing to live according to the laws of nature. They had to do it differently. Therefore, the knowledge which they acquired in the development of their own egos became, we might say, a very complicated form of ignorance. All of that has descended now to our present time. We have schools, we have universities, we have all kinds of places where the individual can go to learn the essential values of a kind of living. In other words, he can find partial solutions, at least, to his determinations to be free, to do as he pleased, and to create a great and opulent future for himself, individually and theoretically, collectively. But the collective part seldom gets mixed up in the idea very deeply. Each person is out for himself. Now, having come to this idea of how to be successful, they began to teach it. And this process of being successful has been what might be termed practical or acceptable learning. So the problem of the individual breaking away from the pattern by motive of self-determinism left a very serious weakness in our systems of learning. In our definite determination to do what we want to do, most of the world has forgotten what we were supposed to do. The idea that we came here from some remote source and went through hundreds of thousands of years to gradually develop a mind has been overlooked almost completely. It has been assumed that the mind was just given to us to do as we pleased with, that we could use it for the most unpleasant thinking, that we could use it to corrupt ourselves and others, and we could use it as an excuse or defense against the mistakes that we make. Now, by the time we have been thoroughly educated, we have what is called acquired ignorance. We have an ignorance which was not given to us by nature or by the gods or by any outside factor. We have acquired a schooling on how to do wrong and get away with it. Or, to say maybe a little more genteelly, the way to live a life in this world with indifference to all the factors that are disagreeable to us. So this is ignorance of the factors that we do not want to accept. We do not want to believe basically in equality. We do not want to basically believe in the victory of right over wrong. We want to believe it theoretically and then do as we please. So we have an education that is now based not upon experience, not upon the wisdom of the elders, not upon the truths that were first carved on the cave walls of ancient France and Spain. What we are now trying to do is to create a new kind of world, a world to be fashioned to do exactly as we please. Perfect freedom. The ability to invent as long as an invention is even possible. The possibility of becoming rich as possible and then holding on to it, which is not so easy. Everywhere we want to be exactly what we want to be. If we want to drink ourselves to death,